immediately after my talk here 2 years ago, I was asked by the Center for Biodiversity and the Center for Food Safety and the Xerces Society if I would like to join them in a petition to protect the monarch as a threatened butterfly, a petition to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I did, and we formed the petition. It's been sent, it will be acted upon probably not until 2019. And that, the long delay in that actually is good because it means they're really interested in it and they're not putting it on the back burner. So I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more later. Well, we also, at the last lecture that I gave, pointed out to you that the monarch seems to be in real trouble. And this is the size of the overwintering colonies going from about 22 years to the present time. And it hit, with measuring it in hectares, the total area of all combined overwintering sites in Mexico. And this year it was up to 20.97, and it's dropped down in the last year. That year when I was here, it was less than a hectare of butterflies. So the picture was pretty bleak, and so here's what the monarchs were like. How did we go from this to this, to requiring it, or hopefully submitting a petition to try to protect the overwintering and migration of this wonderful butterfly? The species itself is not at risk, but the migration and overwintering phenomena are at risk. And that's sort of a different category of conservation, and it's been really important and well accepted by the Secretary of the Interior. So even more importantly, how are we going to avoid this? This is the passenger pigeon, which went extinct at the end of the last century. And ominously, the distribution of the passenger pigeon is very similar to the monarch. Now, just to back up a little bit and give you a little bit of biology of the butterflies, the monarch is a really interesting member of a family of 157 species, most of which occur in the Old World tropics, a few in the New World, and 4 or 5 in the U.S. And they all are feeding on plants that have latex, milk that's found in milkweed in the plants, and they absorb the poisons that are in the plant, and they use it for their own protection. All of the butterflies live in the tropics, and very few of them migrate very long distances. The monarch is absolutely unique in having invaded the temperate zone, where it searches out for milkweed plants, which are really important for them as nectar sources for the adults. They're marvelous nectar sources for all sorts of pollinating insects, as well as the monarch. And then the monarch also lays its eggs on the milkweed. And here's a lady that's flown up from Mexico who's ovipositing on a milkweed. And here's another milkweed with an egg on it that was laid. This one is actually Asclepias grandiflora from Mexico. It's a beautiful plant. And in about 3 days, the little caterpillar hatches out of the egg, and in about 10 days, the caterpillar goes through 5 stages and grows up, multiplying its weight several thousand times, actually. And then it spins up and forms, as you all know, it forms this beautiful green chrysalid. And another week goes by, and that hatches into a magnificent adult monarch butterfly. So each generation of butterflies takes about 3 to 4 weeks to develop. Now, here, what I want to really emphasize is the importance for the evolution of this incredible phenomenon of the monarch is related to the evolution of the milkweed plants. And most people think of milkweed as 1 or 2 species, but there are actually over 120 in North America and Mexico. And at the time this was written was in 1954. There were 108 known species. So the monarch has evolved. It's a temperate plant system that has evolved in this country, especially in the United States. And here is this immense potential food supply which is available during the summer and spring and early fall, but dies back during the winter. So the monarch can come up and exploit this milkweed in the spring and summer, but it has to fly back in the fall to survive somewhere because all the milkweeds die out. They can't keep breeding. Now, monarchs breed in seasonal habitats, as many animals do. And how do animals survive the winter? They do it by hibernating, not a monarch on the left. They can tough it out, or they can migrate. And the monarch is a butterfly that migrates, and it migrates out of the summer breeding range, and it migrates east of the Rockies and east of the Rocky Mountains, and then west of the Rocky Mountains, shown here. And they migrate to overwinter along the California coastline. But the eastern population is probably 1,000 times bigger, at least 1,000 times bigger than the California population. And they migrate all the way to Mexico. Now, so this just gives you an idea of the long distance of this fall migration. It can be up to 2,500 miles, and that's assuming a straight line. Now, the butterflies that are migrating to Mexico, to the Oyamel forests that we're going to look at, have never been there before. How do they know to go back to the same trees that their great-grandparents spent the winter on the last year? I'll come back to that question at the end of the talk. But that's one of the really remarkable aspects of this migration. Now, where are they actually going? They're going out of the range which is going to freeze in the winter, and they're crossing the Tropic of Cancer, and they're going to a series of forests that are about 30 by 60 miles in extent, about 30 miles west of Mexico City. And that's where they have gone year after year. And this is a picture of the range of mountains that goes across Mexico. It's called the Transvolcanic Range. And on that range at about 2,900 to 3,300 meters, about a little over 10,000 feet, there's this beautiful forest of trees that are very much like the balsam firs here. They're like the Christmas trees, the Oyamel fir tree. And it is in that ecosystem that monarchs spend the winter. And one of the things that Ernest and I have been doing in the last decade or so is showing how the forest provides a whole series of important microclimatic protections for the monarch to get through the winters. And because it's such high elevation, there can be freezes and snow and rain and huge storms during the overwintering season. Here you see them coming in. This would be right around the 1st of November in the volcanic mountains in the background. Here is one of the really big colonies, and all this brown cast, that's 3 hectares of butterflies. There's probably 150 million butterflies that you're looking at there. It's just incredible. And then when you walk into the forest and you see the clusters close up, this was the site that I first saw when I was in Mexico in 1977, and it absolutely floored me. And I knew right at that moment in time that this conservation was going to be a major problem in saving this. And it's such an incredible phenomenon. Here they are late in the winter flying out to drink water and flying back in. Here we did a lot of aerial reconnaissance, and here you can see this is a relatively small colony, 0.2 hectares. But again, you see and notice that they're avoiding the treetops. We'll talk about that. This was a really tiny colony, and it's right here. Can you see it? Can you hear me all right now? Okay. Now, at the end of the winter season in March, towards the end of March, the mic went off again. Damn it.
That's what we got for you, Dr. Briar.
Pardon me?
That's what we have for you, so you're all set.
Okay. Okay, so anyway, they spend 5 months, 6 months in Mexico, and then in the spring they fly back and they lay their eggs on the milkweeds on the south, and then the next generation works its way up. So they're getting further and further away from the ones who were in Mexico. So historically, it was an interesting hypothesis that was put forward by the early famous butterfly biologist Henry Scudder. And he proposed that monarchs, they had no idea where they overwinter, but they hypothesized it was somewhere in the south, and that they migrated gradually all through and reestablished the range throughout the area. An alternative was the successive brood strategy, which was put forward by Henry Edwards in 1878. And he hypothesized that they breed in the south and that the new generation works its way up to the north. And we now know from research that we were able to do in our lab that the successive brood hypothesis is correct. So what about the western population? Well, there's an example. Isn't she a wonderful little girl? Every year in Pacific Grove, they have a monarch parade welcoming the monarchs back as one of the principal overwintering sites in the Monterey Peninsula. And I took this one during the parade. And this is an example of the clusters in California, and this is about as big as you ever will see a California cluster. And so the density and the number of butterflies in California is tiny compared to Mexico, but it's still significant. And just as they do in the east, in the spring they fly out into the Central Valley and up into the Sierra Nevadas, and they lay their eggs on, this is Asclepias speciosa, which is related to the one that's common here. And another one, Asclepias vestida, which grows in this habitat. And so the monarchs build their numbers up over the summer. And unlike Mexico, where they're all going into a very concentrated area, California's alteration of the vegetation, probably due to the introduction of eucalyptus trees, monarchs are forming colonies up and down the coast from Baja California to north of San Francisco. And they're literally, I think there's something like 400 overwintering sites. So what is it that produced these billions of monarchs? Well, the spring and summer breeding habitat, milkweed diversity was enormous, the distribution was widespread, and the butterflies were abundant. And I mean, the milkweeds were very abundant. So everything was really wonderful for developing huge generations of butterflies. Then during the fall migration, as they're migrating south, they have to have access to nectar, because the nectar is converted to lipid, and lipid is stored in their bodies, and that fuels the migration south and enables them to get through 5 months in the winter probably with very little feeding on any available nectar. And then the quality of the overwintering habitat was fantastic in Mexico, and we'll look at two aspects of it, microclimate and lipid reserves. How do they preserve their lipids in Mexico during the winter? Well, what has changed? Let's first of all look at the spring and summer breeding habitat. And again, after my talk here, Ernest and I got together and we went out to the prairie to look at the prairie system, which is still intact in some places. The original prairie system was enormous, and here you see it. And so we went out to Missouri and Kansas, and here we are with one of my former students, Ray Morantz, looking for milkweeds in this prairie habitat. And there are probably a dozen species at least that occur in that area. And this was probably where milkweeds were really important for monarch butterflies before we changed that environment. Here is one, this one you've seen before, tuberosa, the butterfly weed. Here is Ernest and Ray looking at Asclepias syriaca, which also occurs there. Asclepias incarnata, the swamp milkweed. Hertella, Sullivanti. It was such a rich environment. It was a wonderful trip that Ernest and I had together. Vestida, Stenophylla, viridiflora, verticillata, and look at all the plants in this field. So that was the cornucopia of milkweeds that monarchs had prior to the loss of so much land in the prairie land. This is along the side of the roads near the prairies. What has changed? Well, one of the things that's changed is that the habitat has been converted to agriculture. And this is a case of where the side of the road was sprayed with herbicides and milkweeds and everything else. All the nectar plants are gone, replaced by hay. And this is right near Kanza Prairie, one of the the biggest prairie left in the United States. And what you can see here is that there's grass here and soybeans here and corn here and not a weed in sight because they've been herbicided. And with the ethanol initiative, there's been a huge move to convert much of this land to growing corn. And one of the things that we noticed when we looked at these fields was if you look at the corn growing, there's absolutely not a single weed anywhere growing because they've been killed by herbicides. It's just incredible. And that's true also in the soybean field. Well, in the 1990s, I did quite a bit of field research in the Midwest, and this was along the side of the road in Minnesota. And in the cornfields adjacent to them, there were just milkweeds, very abundant. And even at that early time, you see these wilting milkweeds had been sprayed by herbicides. And I wrote a paper for the Orion magazine in 2001, and I'll just read you what I wrote. Extensive monarch breeding occurs in milkweeds growing inside cornfields. This underscores the devastating effects that the long-term use of herbicide and genetically manipulated organisms such as Roundup-ready crops will have as their use totally eliminates milkweed from the field. Unfortunately, I was right. Well, let's take a look at the breeding range of monarchs. We'll come back to that. Using isotope analyses, two Canadian biologists have determined that 50% of the monarchs that migrate to Mexico have come out of this region here. And if we look at that region in relation to crops, soybean and corn crops, the two are just overlapping with each other. And now, so what has happened is that corn and soybeans and other crops have been genetically engineered to be resistant to herbicide, Roundup in particular. So that you plant the corn and soybean seeds, they germinate, and then you spray the fields, and it kills everything except the soybean or the corn. And so with the rise of the use of glyphosate, which has been incredible, this is a correlation showing monarchs going down as glyphosate goes up. We don't know that there's an actual causal relation, but there's pretty good evidence that there is. And we did an experiment at Briar College where we sprayed a field with glyphosate, Roundup, and this is an unsprayed area, and these are unsprayed areas. And this was sprayed on June 6, 2014. And you can see that the fields have completely, within 2 weeks, nothing left, dead as a doornail. It just eliminates all other plants. Nectar sources, milkweeds, trees, bushes, shrubs, anything else that's competing with their crops. And I'd just like to ask the question and think about of spraying these toxic chemicals that kill plants again and again and again for soybean and rotating crops with corn. What is that doing to the root system of the plants? Because Roundup is a chemical which causes the breakdown of photosynthesis, and the plants basically starve to death. And that's why it kills the plant completely right down through the root system. Well, this just gives you an idea. 150 million acres of cropland are now sprayed with Roundup. It's just an incredible, and the pounds of I think this is the percentage of the both crops that are now herbicide GMO crops. It's really amazing how fast that's happened and what an impact it has. Now, at the University of Minnesota, Karen Oberhauser and John Pleasance, who's at the University of Iowa, have been doing a bit of research tracking the number of milkweeds that occurred from 99 to 2010. And basically, both studies show just almost a complete collapse of the number of milkweeds in these agricultural fields. So monarchs used to breed extensively inside the cornfields, but now there's no milkweed left, so they're not breeding there. And they estimate that there has been a 58% decline in milkweeds in the Midwest landscape, and an 81% decline in monarch production between 99 and 2010. Well, let's take a look at the fall migration and what may have been happening to the nectar sources. Monarchs depend, as we said, on nectar, and goldenrod is one of the important plants in the fall. We would take a butterfly and extract it and measure the weight of the lipid. And if we look at, this is a really interesting graph. These are summer migratory and early fall migratory butterflies in the north. And the average lipid content is 25 milligrams. But if you go down to Texas and northern Mexico, the average is now 525 milligrams. They've increased their fat content by 500%. And that's all due to nectaring on flowers. And then they live off this nectar in Mexico gradually, and the number that are going to be able to make it back depends upon how much lipid is left in their bodies at the end of the overwintering season. It's an amazing part of the biology of the monarch butterfly. Well, Texas is a key for migration both in the fall and the spring, and as we saw, that was where they are building up their lipid contents. And a couple of years ago, I went to southern Texas with Kip Kiphart, who's a great monarch enthusiast, and we went to this area. This is the Medina River in a normal year, and growing in the floodplain of that is a plant called frostweed, which is a super important milkweed, a super important nectar source for monarchs. And they drink on it by the thousands, and they go into these wonderful floodplain forests. And they build up there. Now, what happened was that in 2011, there was an incredible drought, the worst drought in the history of that part of Texas on record. And this was the Medina River that I just showed you. I couldn't believe it. It just completely dried up. And the understory, no nectar plants available over wide areas. And we measured, this is during a normal year, the average is 182 milligrams of fat. On that dry year, it was down to 40 milligrams of fat. So it's clear that the health and abundance of nectar plants is really important for the butterflies as they're migrating towards Mexico. So that needs to be preserved. Nectar resources in Texas are fallible. Floodplains and oxbows are key nectaring habitats. Nectar resources in northeastern Mexico are crucial, and we don't even know where they are. That's a whole area of research that we need to follow up on. So they're building up this huge amount of fat as they approach the overwintering sites in Mexico. Well, now let's take a look at the over two aspects of the overwintering habitat, microclimate and lipid reserves. There are several challenges to winter survival. I talked about these last time that I was with you all. Desiccation as the dry season advances, bird predation, which is actually more interesting than damaging, freezing to death, and here they are in the tropics, south of the Tropic of Cancer, but potentially freezing to death during winter storms, and then running out of lipid, starving. Here's an example. Linda and I did this study together. We showed that orioles and grosbeaks are eating up to a million butterflies in a season. It's pretty impressive. So the studies that Ernest and I have done together have been looking at the benefits of the microclimate as a result of the. So it was obvious to us that if there's going to be logging and thinning the forest, the butterflies are going to lose their protection from the cold weather and rain and snow and so forth that we knew occurs during these storms. And what we've found is that being under the tree is an advantage to the butterflies. It protects them like a blanket. Being in the middle of a cluster protects them. The ones in the middle of the cluster are warmer when it's cold at night. Clustering on tree trunks helps them, and clustering at intermediate heights helps them. And so that we've done a lot of thermal measurements. These are just some of the gadgetry that we use. These little gizmos here will measure the temperature every hour for 3 months. And they're wonderful for getting data and finding out what's going on. But just looking at the climate in general in Mexico, where the butterflies overwinter from November 2nd when they arrive to April 5th, 1st when they're gone, during the daytime, the temperature gets up to about 68 degrees F, and it's pretty constant with a bit of fluctuation. But compared to the temperature that you would have here, the difference would be absolutely enormous. And the cold temperatures fluctuate too, but again, it's a very narrow fluctuation, so that the environment is pretty stable most of the time. It's not too hot during the day, so that doesn't burn up all the lipids. It's not too cold at night, so the butterflies don't freeze to death, but sometimes they do. And this is one of the studies that Ernest and I and Linda did. This is measuring the temperature in a weather station adjacent to the forest, out in the open, and you can see that it fluctuates between 15 degrees and about a -5. But underneath the trees, where the monarchs are sitting on the trees, the fluctuation is reduced it's cooler during the daytime, and it doesn't get so cold at night. So these data show that keeping that forest intact is really super important to protect the monarch butterflies from freezing. And here they are avoiding the treetops again. So the reason they avoid the treetops is because you get frost that hits the treetops at night, and the trees don't let it get through. And we did this study a couple of years ago. We measured the temperature from the ground level up to above the butterflies to the top of the tree. And you can see that the butterflies are choosing the warmest part of the tree. The cluster density is highest in this part of the forest. And that's exactly where they're smart. They're smart. Well, when I first got there, the very first year, I noticed that logging was going to be a problem, and there was major logging, and there was minor logging done just by individuals surviving, cutting down individual trees, and it didn't seem to make any difference whether they cut them in the colony or not. And then horse logging became really an important, another example of small-scale logging. And we moaned and groaned about this to the Mexican authorities, and in 1980, the president made a decree to protect all monarch butterflies hibernating in breeding grounds in all parts of Mexico indefinitely, and all that did was to keep us from doing research in Mexico. So in 1986, with more complaints, a real conservation effort was made, and there were several areas. The prime areas where the red spots are is where the known colony positions are. They were supposedly protected. Well, the year after that edict was put into effect, the area was clear-cut. Huge area. And these are two mountains that had monarch butterflies on them. This one and this one. And this was really heavy-duty commercial logging. So we wanted again to try to get the government to increase the level of protection. So we did a study where we took aerial photographs from 1971, 1984, and 1999. And what you can see is green is intact forest, yellow is partially thinned, and gray is completely thinned. And you can see what happened. 44% of the forest was lost in the course of 25 years. The Mexican government responded to that with a new decree increasing the protected zone from 16,000 square hectares to from 16,000 hectares to 56,000 hectares. And it tied together the areas within this, where all the colonies were. And we were very pleased about that. But immediately the next year, they were at it again with major illegal logging going on, as you can see in this aerial photograph. And the horse logging on the west face of one of the big, beautiful mountains called Cerro Pelon, the forest where the Urquharts, where Kathy Brugger and her husband, Ken Brugger, discovered the monarch butterflies, it was right here And we just determined that a year ago. We never knew exactly where it was. But this is the forest that is still intact. This entire area was covered with that dense Oyamel fir forest. It's all been horse logged out. We've been trying to stop this. Well, part of our efforts to call attention to the problems in Mexico, we were able to write a document which enabled the UNESCO to declare the area as a World Heritage Site. Well, in 2013, Mexico reported a decline in illegal logging, and so you can see that it went from a large amount to a huge amount and then down and supposedly stopped in 2011. But illegal and legal logging continue, and these pictures were just taken recently in the last year. Well, and now I give you a really miserable story. I was alerted about in November of 2014 that there was a problem in the Sierra Cinque overwintering area. And I got together with my colleague who's from NASA, and he got these satellite images, and this is the area before it was logged, and this is the area after it was logged. And that was 10 hectares of forest that were logged over a period of 3 months. And this is and these are drone images that I was able to get a colleague to take, showing the area that was logged and showing the extent of it and the slopes upon. I mean, it's just a catastrophic. But what was really serious about this is that it was right in the middle of the area where monarchs were discovered on the Sierra Cinque by the Brugers. And these yellow spots are where monarch colonies have formed every year going back to 1975, as far back as we know. Now, there's a ravine here that comes down and goes out this way. And I'm going to show you an aerial photograph of a colony which is right there. Ernest and I just wrote this up with colleagues. Here's the colony. Can you see it? Now, this is a very complicated slide, but I just want to point out one thing. The orange dots are classical records of colonies going back to 1977. The colony that formed this year formed right there, and the area that was clear-cut was right here. So this is in the prime habitat of the butterflies. Unbelievable. And actually, there's somewhere on here there's something that says MA. Can you find that? To the right. Okay. MA is Mojonera Alta, and that is where Ken Bruger discovered the first colony of butterflies on the Sierra Cinque. So this is an historically important area and a key area for overwintering, and just really depressing that they've done so much damage. Well, we got the results back this year. This is the colony decline through times, but things were looking pretty good at the end of last year. The overwintering season, they were up from about less than 1 hectare up to almost 4 hectares. And so there was some good evidence of good news. And the monarch butterfly migration rebounds, easing some fears, according to the New York Times and the Fox News. Big recovery of monarch butterfly observed in Mexico sanctuaries. That was published on the 27th of February, 2016, before the butterflies had left Mexico. And unfortunately, on the 10th of March, an enormous snowstorm occurred, knocking down trees. This is in the Rosario colony, the huge colony that I showed you the aerial slide of. And the mortality, you can see these dead butterflies on the ground, trees down. It's very much like it was in 2002, where we knew that 80%, 75 to 80% of the area of butterflies were destroyed. More than 500 million butterflies were killed that year. We don't know how many were killed this year because we were not allowed to go in and count them. because they didn't want to have it affect the tourist industry. Well, one of the things that happened was that there was winds that apparently hit 70 miles an hour in this area, which is very unusual as far as we know. So there was a double hazard from the storm, butterfly mortality, and then the reserve director gave permission to the loggers to salvage log all the trees that had been knocked down. And so starting in towards the end of March, they were carrying out logs by the thousands, day after day after day after day after day after day. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And read this sign. I translated it here. It's a pretty rough translation. This vehicle transports forest product felled by natural phenomena in the Hito Santa Ana municipality. That's just near the butterflies. Authorized by the authorities with job number XYZ to prevent environmental risk situation, valid until the 31st of October 2016. They're going to allow salvage logging up until the 1st of November, which is when the butterflies come back. Well, the sort of damage that was done by the salvage logging, we were able to get some pictures of that. It's a really serious erosion problem. Areas very seriously thinned, and we know that thinning is so calamitous for the butterflies, protecting them from the storms. And as you can see, I am a tree hugger. And I'm hugging a tree with Elizabeth Howard, who is the author of Journey North. Are you familiar with Journey North? The wonderful website that tracks the monarch migration. And there she is, a wonderful lady. Well, what has changed? Well, let's go back to California, and this is almost equally scary. The Western butterfly count on Thanksgiving started out in 1977 and is down now to a fraction of what it was. And what is sort of scary is that the two curves for California and Mexico are looking pretty similar. There's a lot of evidence that's been adduced recently to suggest that California numbers are dependent upon Mexican numbers. And I think that's why they're going down. They're going down together. But we don't know for sure. Well, one of the reasons that we submitted this petition was to try to get greater interest in the plight of the monarch butterfly. And I think we've had really good success. And just some people think that doing this was bad for the monarch or bad in general. But a lot of species have really benefited by being put on the endangered species list. For example, here the average growth for endangered birds at yearly intervals from the start of protection over the years. And it looks like it's really good news. And hopefully this will be true for the monarch as well as for the bald eagle, as well as for the sand crane is maybe not quite as good as tail. But the red cockaded woodpecker has come back. So what we're very hopeful, and one of the things that this petition has done that's been very positive, is it's raised the interest enormously in the United States. And it even got on the agenda of the three amigos in their meeting in Ottawa this past month. So there's some good news out there. Monarch Joint Venture is a group that's really good if you want to look up biology of monarchs and what's going on. The National Fish and Wildlife Federation has put up several $1 million to try to resurrect milkweed habitat. The Xerces Society is very active in pollination conservation. And then Chip Taylor at the University of Kansas has 14,000 monarch way stations where people have planted milkweed and nectar plants. So a lot of good things are happening. In Journey North, more than 60,000 people are on her website. And one of the principal animals on her website are monarch butterflies. And here you can see an example of where they were doing counts of the migration. Well, I've been studying butterflies for a lifetime. Linda told me I had to put this picture in. I'm still not sure quite why, but thank you, Linda. Now, I mentioned before that monarchs are flying back to the same trees that their grandparents were on, and the question is, how does that happen? And I have a hypothesis, and it has to do with peeing. And I'm going to show you that now. You want to, when this comes up, look over on this side of the picture. Now, how do I do that? Let's make sure this works, Linda. I don't have a mouse. Oh, yeah. Can you click on it? There you go. Just in the black part. Okay, here we go. All right, we can see that. After one storm down there, I came in and there were thousands and thousands of butterflies that were flying around in the air. It just cleared and it stopped raining. And as I looked up, my glasses were covered with drops of pee, butterfly pee. And I said, well, maybe that when they do this, they're actually marking the area with a chemical that the butterflies can recognize the next year when they come back. So this is the first time we've ever had a picture of a butterfly doing this. And so we hope to pursue this and see if it goes anywhere, so to speak. Well, lots of people have helped me, conservationists, colleagues, students, friends. It's been really quite a journey. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you. That worked out pretty well.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for questions if folks have questions. Yeah, yes, right here.
I understood you said that they take the milk from the milkweed that has poisons in it to protect themselves.
Right.
But then when they winter and they head down to Mexico, how are they getting poison to protect themselves? Or is that just for the...
Well, when the caterpillar eats the milkweed,
Oh, it's a caterpillar.
Caterpillar eats the milkweed.
It's not the butterfly.
Right. So the caterpillar stores it and it goes into the butterfly, and the butterfly is then poisonous from that point on.
Oh, okay. It isn't something he has to keep...
No.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.
Good question.
I noticed when they cluster in Mexico, I've never seen butterflies cluster like that. I know it's probably for warmth and protection, but is there any other purpose for the clustering?
That's a really important question that we've never been able to answer. We do know that they're warmer in the clusters at night and cooler during the daytime, so that reduces the probability of freezing when it's cold and reduces the loss of lipids when it's hot, but it's a pretty small effect. I think it's related to the fact that monarchs are toxic and warningly colored. Birds learn not to eat them very rapidly. They actually vomit if they eat them. And so by having that chemical protection and being in huge numbers, it really enhances the chemical protection of the butterfly, because a bird comes into the area, will learn really fast that the butterflies are toxic. So I think the main thing is it's related to the chemical defense of the butterflies, and that in turn probably makes this whole phenomenon possible. Without that chemical protection, they probably couldn't cluster in such dense clusters.
So this is a question about the habitat where they overwinter.
Yeah.
The California population would seem to indicate, because they're now using the eucalyptus, that's somewhat flexible. And so I'm wondering, there doesn't seem to be anything particularly unique about that forest. I'm wondering if there, especially if the urine is a key, there's some way you might be able to relocate some populations of monarchs to help get rid of the problem of this habitat destruction locally.
That is one of the motivations for pursuing that idea. The idea that if you could synthesize it and concentrate it and generate a lot of it in the chemical laboratory, we could take a wet feather duster and dip it in this stuff and take it to Mexico and drag them into a safe place. But that's hopeful. It's a good question. But I think the really important thing is not so much the OEML tree, is the microclimate that is provided by that forest is what protects the butterflies. That's what they're going for. And if there was some other species of tree that provided the same microclimate, then it would probably be a safe place for them to go. But we don't know of any.
What cues are the monarchs using to locate their food sources? Part of the reason I ask is when I walk and look for monarchs, there's certain clusters where I regularly see them and other clusters where I hardly ever see them. So is there some cue specific to the milkweed and then certain clusters more attractive than others?
Apparently, as far as we know, monarchs are pretty much attracted to all species of milkweeds. They seem to be more attracted to the tropical American milkweed than they are to some of the native ones that we have here, which is a problem, another problem. But are you talking about overnight clusters or just milkweed attract?
Summertime feeding, walking up and down the road and noticing that certain plants, certain sets of milkweed in certain locations regularly have caterpillars, whereas other places, say in the field or along the road, I never see caterpillars. And I was wondering if there's some.
Well, let me ask Ernest Williams if he can answer that question, because I can't.
I think there is no complete answer. There are parts to an answer. Another part is simply that they do tend to find patches of milkweed. Doesn't take huge patches, but individual plants are less apt to be found. And also they may fly along road edges. I find more oviposition near road and milkweed patches along road edges. So that may contribute to what you're seeing, but that's only a partial answer.
Yes.
How long can monarchs fly?
They can't fly at night, so they fly during the daytime, and they spend probably 2 months flying getting to Mexico, maybe up to 2 months, but maybe faster than that.
I was curious what height they fly at, and why don't we see clusters of monarchs flying over, or do we?
Well, one time I was in Texas, and it was semi-overcast, and it was right at the height of the fall migration, and there were just a few butterflies flying around in the fields. I looked up in the sky with binoculars, and there were millions of butterflies flying at a height that you could not see with your naked eye. So they fly pretty high, and they also take advantage of tailwinds, which is probably the reason most of them are able to get to Mexico in such good condition.
The Adirondacks has a lot of trees, but there are some milkweed here, and because there's not a lot of agriculture here, there's not a lot of herbicide or pesticide use. The monarchs show up here, but we're at the very northern fringe of the migration. We have milkweeds here in June, but we hardly see the monarchs until like July. This year they're very thin. So I wondered if you would comment on the logistics and the bioethics of maybe bringing individual monarchs, either larvae or adults, leapfrogging them up to a place like the Adirondacks like weeks earlier than they normally.
I think it's a really, really difficult question to answer as to moving them around, because it's such a natural phenomenon and such a big biogeographical evolution that's happened. I don't know what the best thing to do is, but we do know that a lot of tagging has been done by Monarch Watch, following up on Professor Urquhart's tagging program in Canada. And one of the things that we know is that very few butterflies make it to Mexico if they fly along the Atlantic coast or along the Gulf Coast of Florida. And That is very curious as to why that is the case, because there's a large amount of breeding and there's large migrations through Cape May, New Jersey, where we've measured it, for example. So what is happening to those butterflies? And it could very well be that the eastern contribution of butterflies to Mexico is pretty small, judging from the recapture data. So it gets back to that Midwest as such an important breeding area for monarchs. And one of the things that the Fish and Wildlife Service is supporting is planting milkweeds along highways and having decent cutting regimes that don't take out all the nectar sources in the milkweeds, and power lines. And several people are working with farmers to dedicate parts of their fields to native plants. So there's a lot of good things going on, and we'll hope that makes a big difference.